I will get random direct messages out of nowhere, people I've never met before, that will just say, here comes a northbounder. Never met the guy, don't know who he is. It's just, that's it. And there's no other conversation after it. Just
so funny.
That's how much of an impact that those two episodes, the Clear Line episode and the Northbounder.
It's almost like Seinfeld, no soup for you.
No soup for you. Northbounder, Paul. What are you doing?
What? I thought you just said what?
Oh my God!
I'm sorry. I thought you said turn me loose.
I said here comes a northbounder.
Okay, well, I didn't hear you correct. It's really
one right here, man. Right on the tip of this piling to the little. Okay, let it sit. Let it sit. My whole thing is this: like on the boat, I take it very seriously. I don't put the blame on anybody that doesn't deserve it. I don't. If I'm not finding fish, or if I'm not getting the boat where it needs to be. I might be on fish, but I can read the fish, and I always watch when they come up, and I'm like, they're not feeling it. And if they're not feeling it, or if the cast is such that 90% of the people that get on the boat could not make it, I'm not getting upset. I'm not getting aggravated. Sure. I'm not getting any of that. But what happens is, I always tell people, it's just like this. You're playing one of those games like Pictionary that has that little timer, and it starts off and it goes dee, 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 dee. And by the time you're almost about done, where you run out of time, the timer's going dee, 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 dee. And so what happens is all day long you're hunting. You're hunting, and man, some days are tough, and you're out all day, and you're pushing, and you're searching, and looking, and nothing. And yes, the guy's getting fatigued, and he's getting tired, and his whole focus, which in the tournaments is so important, everything is starting to dwindle, and you're losing him. And you're losing yourself. It's hard to stay focused. And then all of a sudden, what do you think happens? That one stop that you make, and here they are, and they're doing it, and they're happy, and there's not a boat anywhere near you, and you're like, we're going to do it. Right now, we're going to do it. And then all of a sudden, first cast, hook yourself in the back. Second cast, hook the push-pull. Third cast, you're stuck on the rub rail because you... and then all of a sudden, I start to get a little, where I'm like, okay, we need to pull this together. This is our moment.